I'll start with an introduction. So just briefly though, to give you a feel for what we're doing today. The title of this presentation is Support for Gaining Work for People Living with Long-Term Conditions, and particularly focusing on how qualitative evidence synthesis can help us understand success of tested interventions. And this is based on some work that a team of us did recently. So it's not moving. Oh, there we are. Okay, just needed to click a different button. So I'm guessing that William is not with us today, because I'm sure he's got plenty of other things to do right now, given the change of situation overnight.
Joe, he's been in the waiting room as well, so I've just sent him the link too.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, good on him. Cool. Well, in that case, I'll do a little bit of an introduction to myself, and maybe he'll be here by the time by the time he joins, it'll be ready for his introduction. So just to give you a little bit of background to who I am, as Jean said, just recently based in Auckland. So we're facing a big change in our freedoms today. I've been out to the supermarket this morning doing various things. I've got a 6-year-old at home watching 1938 Robin Hood right now. So we'll see how it goes. My background is that I studied psychology, and I worked for a little while in vocational rehabilitation. And around about 2006, I was getting a bit frustrated with a lack of what I saw as evidence-based information available for what I was doing in vocational rehab, and applied for a research assistant job at AUT, which was advertised by Professor Kath McPherson, and I was fortunate enough to join her team at the time. And I'm sure many of you might know Kath, either in person or by reputation, but she's a very high integrity, high energy researcher, and she ran that team at the time, and I was very inspired by being in her team, and so I stayed on, and I did a master's and a PhD with Kath. I met many of the people that I now know through at the RTRU during that time, and then now I am Deputy Director of the Centre for Person-Centred Research, which is the centre that Kath started at AUT, but she's now gone to do other things. She's currently our Deputy Vice-Chancellor actually, but she was up until recently also at the Health Research Council. So Nicola Kayes now leads the centre, and I'm deputy, and I lead the theme of research which is focused on vocational rehabilitation, and I also lead the postgrad paper we have at AUT, which is also focused on vocational rehab. So that's a little bit about my professional background, and I wonder if William's with us yet.
Yep, hello.
Hi.
Hi. I found the link. I had the wrong link. Hi, my name's William Levesque. I am normally a member of the Rehabilitation Teaching and Research Unit, but now, as of January this year, I'm the Dean of the Wellington campus for University of Otago, and very busy with level 2 COVID alerts at the moment. So that's my life. Yeah.
So if you, I have put on there also a link to a summary of findings that we've produced about this work, the broader part of the work, and also that's the same place that we will put out links to publications, hopefully in the very near future. So yeah, if you want further information, there's that, and also I'm giving you my contact details. I'm hoping you can't hear the music going on in the background.
Sounds good.
It's just fine, Joe.
Okay,
it's just fine.
Right. So I also want to acknowledge the wider team, because it's actually a really big team that did this work. So I was principal investigator, and William was our methodological lead. But there were also a number of other people involved whose names are listed there, and every one of those people played a really important part in the project. So I just want to acknowledge that. So what I chose to focus on today is to introduce the topic area around long-term conditions in work, and also talk a little bit just briefly about what the recent review we did was about. Then I want to look at briefly at what evidence we looked at from controlled trials, and ask the question, what can we understand from our findings? Because there is evidence that you can get from controlled trials, and then there's lots of questions that you have about, what makes this work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can understand from those findings and what questions does it raise. But then talk a lot more about what the another part of the work that we did, the qualitative evidence synthesis, which I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that is, actually highlights in terms of what we can find out about what the interventions that are shown to work, and also raise a few questions around, what does our review raise for consideration that's not visible from controlled trials, and also some of the challenges that came up in the study itself. So it's short, it's not going to cover everything, but focusing in on some things that I think you might find quite interesting. So just a brief introduction first to the topic area and the specific project. So what we mean by long-term condition, I'm just going to talk about that a little bit first. So what we mean by that is living with the effects of an injury, illness or health condition that is expected to continue into the foreseeable future. Oh no, sorry, it's my phone. I've also got a partner out of town at the moment. I'm trying to get him back. Sorry, I'll just turn my phone off. And so a long-term condition, people might expect physical, cognitive, sensory, emotional or functional difficulties that might be expected to stay the same or slowly improve or perhaps decline over time. And when people are living with long-term conditions, they often experience disability. And I think it's really important to say what we mean here by disability, because there are lots of different ways of talking about disability. So here we're talking about disability as a limitation in the ability to participate in activities that are important and appropriate within the social and cultural norms, and as a result of an interaction between an impairment and the context in which someone lives. So it's not the impairment that causes the disability, it's the interaction between the impairment and the context and those social and cultural norms. And so when we're looking at this area, we are thinking about, people with long-term conditions often have difficulty accessing or maintaining paid work, particularly employment. So that's what we were interested in for this study. And just to give you a little bit of background to the way the study came about, it was actually prompted by a request for proposals, particularly focused on supporting people with long-term conditions into employment, that came out as a Ministry of Social Development and Health Research Council partnership grant. And one of the things that they were asking for was a comprehensive systematic review. And so we got a lot of people together from lots of different organisations in order to put together a solid proposal to make that happen. And so what is a systematic review of the literature? Because that's what this was about. So a systematic review of the literature very briefly looks at what research has been done around the world, looks at how reliable the results of that research are, and what has been shown to work and in what context. It can also look at common themes in people's experiences, and I'm talking about the qualitative part here. It can show gaps where more research is needed. And all of this information can, of course, be used to inform the design of services and also future research. So where there's gaps, we can say what's needed, and where they have information, we can use that to either improve or design services. And so our project was, it wasn't actually just one systematic review, but it was a collection of systematic reviews which were designed to answer the very broad question that was needed from the Ministry of Social Development. So, actually, I'm going to let William talk a little bit about this, because I think one of the things that William said first off was, if we're going to do this, we actually need to start with looking at what systematic reviews already exist.
Do you want to talk about this now?
Yeah, just briefly.
Cool. Yeah. So, I've been aware over time when government departments often have an idea about what they want, and sometimes they haven't had an academic background, so they haven't been sort of engaging in the literature themselves to a great extent. And so a government department often may sort of request for a review on a particular topic to be conducted without sort of knowing whether or not a review like that has been conducted before. So there's a risk that that the government would spend money on a literature review that's already exists, already is out there. And so what we proposed in our original application, which we ended up doing, was beginning with what's called an overview of systematic reviews, and it's starting to sound a bit like a snake eating its tail at this point, but an overview of systematic reviews is in essence a systematic review of systematic reviews. And so what we wanted to do was to undertake a highly comprehensive search strategy in order to identify every single systematic review that had been completed on the topic of interest, and then critically appraise those systematic reviews, because you can have high quality and low quality ones, and then extract the findings from those systematic reviews, plus look at what gaps existed, what systematic reviews should be done that hadn't been done, and so or which systematic reviews hadn't been updated that really needed to be updated. So that provided a stronger foundation for a more comprehensive approach to screening the literature, rather than starting from a position of assuming we knew nothing. One comment about overviews is that they're particularly useful when you have a research topic like this, which is about gaining and sustaining work, but you're wanting to look at that question from the perspective of a range of different populations. So the sorts of populations that are involved in this particular sort of area of systematic review could involve people with mental health conditions, or people presenting with autism, through to people presenting with spinal cord injury. And so these different conditions obviously have different sort of contexts. And so conducting an overview to look at the similarities and differences between delivery of interventions is a good way of approaching this type of question. Is that as much as you want me to say at that point, Joe, or would you like me to go on a bit more detail?
Joe's had an overheated computer and is currently just dropped off the call, and will be back as soon as she can persuade her computer that it's not too hot, not too menopausal to work. So, William,
I can talk a bit more
talking.
about how about I share some slides.
Yes.
This is a little. I'm going a little bit off piste now, because Joe had a presentation organised for the people.
Oh, Joe's back. Look, you don't have to worry. Joe's
Great.
Here.
My computer overheated. Sorry.
Wow. Blow on it. I was just explaining the rationale behind why you might want to do an overview of systematic reviews as a starting point for this work, and how it interacted with identifying gaps for future systematic reviews that needed to be done, or areas where there were gaps in sort of the knowledge base. So that was kind of the rationale. Right. And because you disappeared, I started launching into an older presentation about the findings from the systematic review, but I'll hand over to you now.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, hopefully I'm sharing again now. Oh yeah, well look, it even went back to where I was. Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, an overview of systematic reviews was the starting point. And then in addition to that, we looked at controlled trials that have been published in the last 15 years. And we focused we focused that review on 3 specific populations: people living with mild to moderate mental health conditions, people living with amputation, and people living with progressive neurological conditions. And the reason that we chose those 3 is because we couldn't do everything. And those 3, there were a couple of criteria. One is that they were very different. We saw them as very different in terms of the sorts of challenges that people might experience in trying to gain paid work. It was quite give us a bit of diversity, but also it meant that we could tap into different, we could tap into stakeholders in each of these very specific groups to be what we call stakeholder reference groups, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about in a minute. We also did a separate review looking for any peer-reviewed literature published in the last 15 years They reported on support to gain work for Indigenous people living with long-term conditions. And the reason we searched that separately is because often we found that we actually needed to go different places to look for the research specifically focused on Indigenous peoples. And we looked at qualitative research published in the last 15 years on support for gaining paid work for people living with long-term conditions. So it's a whole lot of different reviews which kind of collated at the end to make sense of the question. And to give an idea about why we're doing these different parts, I'm going to talk a little bit about what controlled trial evidence gives us and a little bit about what qualitative research gives us. So controlled trial evidence, it tends to be used to test interventions. William, I'm sure you can, this is my very simplified kind of explanation, which I'm sure you'll do a better job of explaining, but I'll give it a go. So, you know, it provides intervention to one group of people and not to another. And then you've got a control group who don't get the intervention, and then you measure the difference in the outcomes between those two groups. And controlled trials can show the effectiveness of clearly defined interventions. So you've got an intervention, you give it to one group and not another, and you can see how effective that is. But in order to be able to conclude that an intervention is effective, we need to have a few conditions which are satisfied. One is that the trials that are done have low risk of bias. So that means that the results are influenced only by the intervention as much as possible. We also need to be seeing greater positive outcomes for intervention groups beyond what we expected by chance. And that's what people mean when they talk about statistical significance. And also, it's not just one study that we look for in proving that something is effective. We actually need to see many studies that show similar findings. Is there anything you'd add to that, William? That brief explanation?
No, that's great. I think the other thing that's really worth knowing about controlled trials is that the findings reflect the difference in outcomes between the two, between the intervention and the control group. So it's just as important to know what the control group received. And so in the context of vocational rehabilitation, it might be that the intervention group gets some particularly sort of souped up version of sort of supported employment, and the control group gets a standardized version or a pair-back version of supported employment. And both groups might benefit from those interventions, but the study will only tell you what the relative benefit is of those two interventions. The other thing to bear in mind is that if with a lot of these types of trials, there isn't a sugar tablet for vocational rehabilitation that you can take. There's always an underlying level of employment or unemployment occurring in the community. And so the findings for one particular study at one point in time in this context can vary from another point in time depending on what the underlying employment and unemployment levels are. So it's not often people sort of look for a statistical difference or an effect size and sort of hang their hat on that as kind of as the conclusion that that intervention under investigation was good or bad, but it's really only better or worse than the comparative intervention. So it's really important to look at what that comparative intervention is. And when you pull the studies from multiple interventions, obviously each study has a different sort of baseline kind of comparator. And so that's often a source for variability in study findings. That might be slightly too much information now. But.
No. And I'd say the other thing, Joe, is that in terms of outcomes beyond chance, you can have a highly statistically significant finding that isn't clinically important.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so I think that's the other thing I would add to that, is it's not just about whether it's more than is expected by chance, but also whether it actually, for the people particularly, does it matter?
Yeah, exactly.
Does that amount of difference matter?
Yeah, and there's quite a bit of discussion of this in the vocational rehabilitation.
Yeah.
And because, well, first of all, that what people usually get is what they call usual care, and what usual care is varies a lot between settings. And so, what is the comparison? But also, what is meaningful and what is cost effective in terms of how much difference we need to make it worthwhile. So the other thing that we looked at, of course, here is qualitative studies, and qualitative studies focus on experiences and socio-cultural context. And so, while we can test very well defined interventions, we may not have the information to make a very well-defined intervention in some contexts, or in some populations, or in some, or in some situations. And so, much of the information that we need about how to design interventions that works for people comes from qualitative research. I have to say it's not the only use for qualitative research, but in this context, that's the way we were looking at it. So just to give you a bit of a sense of how we designed the study and how it worked, because it was a little bit different to, I guess, your run-of-the-mill systematic review. We've already talked about how it's lots of individual reviews collated at the end, but also we're slightly different in the use of stakeholder reference groups. And this is something which is starting to become, starting to get a bit of attention, because, while we can say that we're being objective in the way that we're carrying out a systematic review, actually the design of the review in terms of what we do, what we include, what's included and excluded, how we search and where we search, these are all things that need to be informed in the way that it's done. And so our approach was to involve a group of four groups of people who were advocates, clinicians, and people with lived experience, who actually we had discussions with at each stage of the review, or 3 key stages of the review actually, in order to inform what we were doing. And so we had 3 condition-specific groups which were focused on those 3 conditions that we focused on in our systematic review. So that's people living with amputation, people living with mild to moderate, people living with mental health conditions, and people living with progressive neurological conditions. And then we had a Māori stakeholder reference group as well. So when we were designing the protocol, we actually designed that in consultation with those reference groups. Then we developed a search strategy also based on that conversation to find research. The search strategy gave us some research reports. Then we took those away, and as a research team we made decisions based on our protocol about the relevance of each research report to the review question, and that included a quality assessment. Oh, I can't see what I put there. Move this. So yeah, then we had findings that, we decide which findings are relevant to the review, again, based on our protocol and what was included and excluded. And then we went back to our stakeholder reference groups to discuss those findings in terms of, what the real world meaning of those were, basically. So I'm going to talk, now that I've introduced you to the study design and the topic area, I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, notable findings from the controlled trials that we looked at. So it's a fairly brief discussion actually, because what we found is actually there was quite a lack of controlled trial evidence for most interventions which was focused on gaining work. So what we found was that when there were no interventions other than one called individual placement and support, which were identified as having clear support from controlled trials. There were no long-term conditions other than mental health conditions that had clear evidence to support any specific intervention. And so there are no other clear evidence found in the overview of systematic reviews, apart from for mental health conditions. And only the review that focused on mental health conditions of our 3 condition-specific reviews actually even found relevant studies. So for the other 2, we actually found no studies that met our inclusion criteria. And so what this tells us is that, if we think about, what's actually happening out in the community and clinical practice, we know that there are vocational interventions that are used. But what this is telling us is that very few are being tested for efficacy in controlled trials. And of course, there are lots of reasons that might be the case. I think probably a really important one is lack of funding for this type of research. And I think particularly, what we found when we looked at those condition-specific reviews is a lot of the trials that are being done are focused on treatment and surgery, basically drug treatment and surgery. And so I think vocational interventions are often considered secondary to those other types of treatments. And so probably get lower priority in terms of research and research funding. But of course, there are lots of reasons that this might be the case. This is just us musing on what this means.
Can I add a comment?
Yeah.
I found this really surprising. And the reason why I found it surprising is the size of the disconnect between the importance that's been placed on policy for supporting people with disabilities to gain employment since at least like 1880 or 1905. And in areas that I've worked, like traumatic brain injury, and done research in traumatic brain injury, way back in the 80s, there were documents saying that gaining employment was one of the sort of 3 top outcome measures to evaluate the success of rehabilitation programs. And so there's what I mean by disconnect. There's a disconnect between the importance that's placed on us at a policy level and the amount of good research that's been conducted on it, even good non-clinical trial research as well. So there's clearly room here for, well, if anybody wants to do a PhD, there's room here for a PhD.
It's also very interesting, I think, that individual placement and support has so much that's been researched about it, because it actually seems quite intentional. So the developers of the individual placement and support approach, which I will explain a little bit more in a minute, clearly knew how important it was to do research on it. And my understanding from just talking with these people is that it was developed as an evidence-based intervention. So it was developed from the research and then tested and tested and tested. So it's been quite I think quite an intentional strategy on the part of the people who developed this particular intervention, which is interesting in itself, because obviously it doesn't normally happen.
One of the characteristics of it, interestingly, is the quality of the fidelity measures, which are sort of like the measures that you use to tell whether or not you're doing individual placement support or not. And that's really important from getting funding for your research project perspective, that you can distinguish between your intervention and what other people might be receiving in a control group. And so it's interesting how the research culture, contemporary research culture, probably influenced the way individual placement and support actually was created, probably.
Yeah, I think you're right. So in terms of the evidence that we found for the individual placement and support approach, it was both in the overview of systematic reviews and also in the review of controlled trials for people living with mild to moderate mental health conditions. So the overview of systematic reviews showed us that there was a high quality, fairly recent 2017 review that showed that there was substantial evidence supporting this approach for people living with a diagnosis of what they call severe mental health conditions. And severe mental health conditions covers things like schizophrenia, and other psychotic conditions, bipolar, severe depression. And that's where the focus for the development of the approach was in that particular population. And then the review of controlled trials for people living with mild to moderate mental health conditions, we found 7 small trials that showed a clear positive interventionist effect for IPS that has been modified for people living with mild to moderate mental health conditions. So that meaning that's sort of largely anxiety and depression. And so just to give you an idea of what this is, for those of you who haven't come across it before, so this approach basically advocates that the overall approach is to place and then train. So there's no minimal or pre-placement training for people in terms of work skills or workability. And then so most of it actually happens in getting the placement and then supporting the person on the job. So it's principle based, and what William was talking about before, where there's a fidelity measure that's used. And the fidelity measure actually measures how well these principles are followed when it's implemented. So it's low caseloads, meaning 20 or fewer per employment specialist. And they don't have any exclusion criteria. The only thing they do is they work with a client who wants a job. So the person, I guess, has to want a job. They have to want to work with the employment specialist. But other than that, there's no exclusion criteria. It is integrated with mental health treatment. So the employment specialists are considered a discipline within the treatment team, and they are supervised and developed as a vocational unit. So like the other professions, they have a professional identity and they're part of a multidisciplinary team. There's an employment focus, and the employment specialist works with the client across all their phases of the vocational journey. It's integrated with benefits counselling and also other work incentives planning. The job search is individualised. We would say personalised now, because we've had lots of discussions about this with our Māori stakeholder reference group. Personalised is becoming the preferred language here. Also, personalised to the interests and skills of the person who's looking for the job. There is a focus on rapid job search for competitive employment, so not sheltered employment, basically, that means. Although there may be discussion with employers about creating jobs that suit the person's skill set and availability. The employment specialist also actively engages in job development, which is what I was just talking about then, on behalf of the client. So develops relationships with employers and actively seeks to create individualised approaches. And there's that personalised follow-along support for as long as it's required. So it's not considered as something which has an end date. The end date is determined by what's going on in that situation. Now, the reason I've just gone into a reasonable amount of detail to lay out what these principles are is because when we look at the qualitative evidence in a minute, what we're going to be talking about, how the qualitative research relates to these principles. And so in that network meta-analysis, the 2017 review that we found in our overview, it compared 3 types of vocational interventions. So it compared pre-vocational training, which is work-related training in preparation for job placement, which has a focus on being work-ready, so developing skills before you go into a job. They compared that with transitional employment, which is where you've got people doing work tasks in a segregated environment as preparation for paid work, and that might include sheltered workshops or doing work tasks as training for paid work, or things like social enterprises where you've got time-limited work, which is done with a view to transitioning into competitive employment. And they compared both of those against what they called supported employment, which in this context was essentially the individual placement and support approach. And so, what they found was that the IPS was more effective, according to the evidence that we have at the moment, than both of these other approaches. And then when we looked at the studies which had modified IPS for mild to moderate mental health conditions, we found 7 studies which was focused on IPS, which was the largest number of studies for mild to moderate mental health conditions in vocational interventions. But we also found a couple which were focused on cognitive behavioural therapy with work-focused components. And there were a couple more specialised ones which were specifically linked to existing systems or contexts, which I'm not going to go into at all, actually. And cognitive behavioural therapy, again, there was a lot of diversity in the 2 studies, and also not very conclusive results. So we weren't really able to make any conclusions about that as an approach. But in terms of the IPS approaches, again, when we looked at them, William did a meta-analysis of the results of those studies, and it showed a clear intervention effect, although it was a very, we don't really have a lot of information at the moment. The precision was quite poor because we're not working with a lot of studies or a lot of participants with this yet in the amount of evidence that's available. Oh, hold on a second. You all right? Pardon? Your Lego bike. Okay, I will help you fix it after I finish this. Okay? Okay. Thank you for telling me. Can I just close this door? Sorry. Did you want to add anything about the meta-analysis, William?
No. That was interesting though.
Yeah. Okay. We'll go with it. So when the IPS was modified for this, for mild to moderate mental health conditions, a few things needed to change because, of course, the setting was different. While IPS, which is delivered in with what they classify as severe mental health conditions, it's delivered within intensive mental health treatment, and so the treatment setting was different in these other studies, and so that kind of forced people to think about, okay, well, who is the team here where the employment specialists were situated, because we're wanting a multidisciplinary team and we're wanting it to be situated within within treatment services of some sort. There was a little bit of discussion, a few different approaches from the different studies about who that team ended up being and what the setting was. Some studies added principles which they thought were more applicable to this population, so things like stimulating motivation and having cognitive strategies in there, including one which coupled it with cognitive behavioural therapy intervention. So there are a few different approaches to modifying the intervention itself, but I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that. It's just sort of information, because what I really want to do is say, okay, well, so we've got this intervention which is showing some pretty positive results in terms of, effectiveness when tested in controlled trials. So how can we understand what's going on here? And so this is where our qualitative findings, I think, can be quite useful. So for our qualitative review, we decided, because we were going to synthesize the results, which means kind of combine them all, and they're no longer associated with the individual studies. We were only going to include high quality studies, and so we actually, as part of the process for doing this, we actually excluded all the ones that didn't meet what we considered to be a high quality study on the critical skills appraisal program qualitative assessment tool. So we ended up, in the end, we started with quite a lot, as you can see from this diagram. It took a long time to screen all these studies, but we ended up with 27 studies that addressed the social, cultural and biographical influences on access to paid work, 35 studies that addressed the experiences that people had of trying to gain paid work, and 20 studies that specifically address the experiences of vocational rehabilitation and employment support. So it's the services themselves. And I'm actually not going to talk about that last one at all in the discussion today, because those findings were quite distinct. But the other two, the experiences were seen in the social, cultural and biographical influences, and vice versa. And so those two sets of results were quite related. I'm putting this up there because it's useful just to see where the studies came from, and what conditions the studies focused on. So the majority of studies were from North America, and the majority of studies, there was a large proportion of studies that focused on mental health conditions again. So much fewer which focus on other long-term conditions. And most of them use interviews and focus groups. And I guess just as an overview to start off with, what we found was that the qualitative studies across the long-term conditions, not just the mental health focused ones, tend to support the IPS principles for support for gaining work. And so the other thing they did was they provided a lot of really interesting, useful examples of the positive effects of flexibility and creative solutions on workability. There were quite a few studies that focused on that. They demonstrated the importance of successful employment and work experiences for all stakeholders, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about that in a bit. But I guess what we came away with in thinking about, well, what does this mean? I think the qualitative research in this area clearly demonstrated that the visibility of people who are living with a long-term condition, coping and succeeding at work, is what affects beliefs and reduces discrimination, because discrimination was something that was talked about a lot in these studies, but also we were seeing some of the positive things that were happening where that was being challenged. So in terms of the way the qualitative status findings support these IPS principles, I mean, these are sort of, I guess, 5 that I pulled out as kind of salient ones. The qualitative research made it clear that going outside traditional job advertisement and recruitment processes opens up opportunities for people. They showed how access to real-world skill-building opportunities that are possible now with flexibility or adjustments are really important. They talked about how important it is to have consistent messaging about workability from health and social care professionals, because it was kind of, this was talked about a lot in the negative actually, where people were getting, you know, a message from say a vocational service about needing, you know, being able to work, but then from all the other treatment services they were in touch with about about that not being an expectation or not being possible. Clear and accurate financial advice to address the fear of further poverty. Again, this was addressed a lot in the negative in the qualitative findings, but you can see the parallel in the principles in IPS. And sharing information about condition-specific needs often requires support. So, you know, having someone available to actually support the negotiation with employers and the sharing of information can be really useful. So I've got 9 points. Maybe we have time for this. It's gone a little over time, hasn't it? I did have 9 points that I was going to go through. What do you think? How much discussion do we need to leave time for? And how over? Yeah, can I get some feedback?
Jo, essentially, if you have time to do it, do all 9. This is being recorded, so people who have to leave to get back to work can pick up the recording later and hear what they haven't been able to hear. So if you've got the time, we'd love to hear all 9. All
right, I will go through the 9 points then, but I'll make it relatively brief because I think, you know, the slides are fairly self-explanatory. Okay, so the first one was that there was a significant influence of psychosocial context on what people felt able to do. So family and community backgrounds, the people's family, partners, and community were all really influential in supporting understandings of what was possible. So if someone's living with a long-term condition, you know, the beliefs and the attitudes of the people around them were really important in terms of how viable they thought it was to work. There was lots of time and energy that they needed to, for some people at least, needed to manage the condition. And that can either be overemphasized or overlooked. So in some treatment services it was overemphasized, and in some vocational services it tended to be overlooked. So, you know, the idea of, you know, being, needing time to do condition management was not understood so well. And in factors such as culture and gender influence what's considered to be acceptable. So for example, there was a study which looked at how for female participants it was easier to ask for accommodations because autonomy isn't something that's quite so expected of female versus male. So this links with the IPS principle of having support integrated with existing treatment and management of the condition, and also the personalised support. I've got a couple of things here as well. We're looking at also possible gaps. You know, I think one of the things we talked about in the Māori stakeholder reference group was, you know, that this is great having this individualised support, but we're a family and whānau in this, and I think it's been developed in an environment, largely North America, where there's not a lot of focus on that. And so when we're thinking about how it's implemented here and how it's done here, then that needs to be to have more of a focus. So the second point was around the risk and the fear people have of being worse off with employment. So first of all, poverty was a significant barrier to actually try and work. And sometimes because people felt like they weren't able to meet expectations of being able to be there on time because of having to rely on public transport or relatives, being able to be dressed appropriately for interviews and for a job. So there was that. And also there was a threat of benefit loss or reduction if someone tries something and it doesn't work. And there was lots of horror stories that circulated among participants, people who were on unemployment benefits or sickness benefits or those sort of similar about what happens if it doesn't succeed. And also people are very aware that income support is often tied to other benefits like medical housing benefits. And so in terms of the IPS principles that this relates to, that's kind of relates to that inclusion of benefit planning, which is one of the principles that they use. And also I would argue a possible gap would be, it's all very well to say that these things are an issue and we need to be working with individuals to look at them, but actually there needs to also be some system level advocacy related to the needs of people with long-term conditions, because it needs to be considered if the sorts of well, my understanding is that the benefit systems at the moment are quite punitive anyway. But are there other messages that we need to be thinking about in terms of what we're supporting and what the system is doing, I guess. The third point is around the accessibility of the workplace and the work environment. So transport to the workplace is often an issue for people with regard to time and also how accessible things were to the transport that they had available to them. And although people were often able to access workplace accommodations, they had issues like them being quite technological. Therefore, the access to technical support could often be the difference between success and failure in terms of how well those accommodations worked. So again, the IPS principle that this relates to would be support that runs from thinking about work right through to maintaining the job. So that runs right through. And a possible gap might be, this is amusing, I think, because this is based on talking to the stakeholder reference group and the people who are working in this area, might be continuing professional development regarding accommodation options, because this changes a lot, and especially with the rate of change around technologies at the moment. Fourth point being there was a lot of focus on identifying that there were some pretty significant disadvantages that people felt with the way that work is at the moment. And I've called this the neoliberal focus. So available jobs are increasingly skilled work. And also people talked about there being a culture of super productivity. So unwritten rules requiring more than the job description to meet the requirements or be competitive. And, thinking about this, I thought about this a lot actually, and, it wouldn't take very much for me not to be able to do my job because of the culture at the moment of productivity and these unwritten rules. So, there's an assumption in employment services, because they're related, of course, to the job market, of needing to be stable or improving to be work ready. And this is a problem for people who were experiencing their condition as either fluctuating or deteriorating. They felt like employment services actually didn't provide for what they needed. And so the IPS principles that relate to this will be around what they call job development. So that's tailoring work in conversation with employers as opposed to just using standardised expectations. And a critique which I would offer is a question about whether this current culture really should be the default. What are we creating by having this environment where work is getting more and more difficult to just be able to do a basic job. The fifth point is the influence of flexible structures and employment practices on workability. So it's kind of the flip side of what I just talked about. So with the neoliberal work environment, you've got this particular culture, but you've also got a lot more in terms of it being acceptable to have flexible or part-time work. So where people had good experiences, where they were able to negotiate work that fitted in their skills and availability, and also where they were able to use their own life experiences that contributed to a qualification for the job. So, for example, where their experiences with services, meant that they were a good advocate, or their experiences with a particular type of, with their particular life experiences meant that they could actually be more empathetic with the people they were working with, whatever it was. Hold on, it's my son. Yeah. Stopped. Okay, I just have to go and hold on a second. I won't be off. Yeah.
Let's just push Robin down the stairs.
Right here.
Mom. Just,
Yeah.
let's just push Robin down the stairs.
Can you go from there? Is that right? A bit too fast?
Not too bad.
Then I can't see you going to be finding the right place. I don't get. Sorry, everybody. Okay.
I just hope Robin's okay, Joe. You know, someone got pushed down the stairs, did they?
Oh, Robin Hood. Yes. 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 I think he's all right. I think we're okay. Yeah. Okay. So where were we? Oh yeah. I guess we had the employer's perspective coming through as well, where people felt like they, once they did embrace a flexible, interdependent work culture where they could, they actually benefited from a more diverse workforce. So again, this links with the IP's principle about working directly with employers to educate and develop opportunities. So educate employers, that is, and develop opportunities for people. And we had a little bit of a critique here around the possible effect of standard job descriptions. I think that standardised job descriptions are often seen to be creating equity, but it kind of raises a question about the limits of that, the equity that can be created by standardised job descriptions, and whether creating a job description based on an idea of a person might actually be not as equitable as we might think. So the sixth point being reliance on informal or alternative routes into employment, and that came through really strongly, particularly in the studies which are about experiences of trying to gain paid work. So there was tended to be an assumption that any long-term condition would negatively affect someone's ability to do the job, or what's often referred to as ableism. So what people did then in response to that is they worked extra hard at becoming extra qualified. They did more training. They worked harder just to consider themselves employable. And then, as well as that, people felt the need to hide problems at work. So where they weren't coping, they tried to do things to hide that or to make up for it in other ways. But what, of course, one of the studies pointed out, what that does is that actually perpetuates those issues of it being considered that long-term conditions negatively affect ability to do the job. And if you can't do the job, you're not in the job. Or if you can't cope with the job, then you're not there. Whereas actually there are a lot of people coping with work in lots of different ways. And people found, again, that networking, internships, those are approaches that didn't rely on those sort of formal job seeking approaches tended to be more successful. And again, that links to the IP's principle of being based on a networking approach. So, having low reliance on job ads and actually being focused on working with employers and accessing placements that way. And, related to what I just talked about, I think the critique here is that because of these issues, there's actually a lack of visibility of people with long-term conditions who are coping and succeeding in work. People tend to hide the difficulties they have and the way that they're making up for those, the way that they are responding, I guess, not making up, or responding to those difficulties, because they don't want to emphasise how their long-term condition affects their work. And related to that, of course, negotiating disclosure was a big issue that people talked about a lot. So disclosure was seen as quite powerful in terms of enabling things. So it enabled trust relationships in the workplace. It enabled people to feel valued and supported once that conversation, if there was a positive conversation, was happening. And of course, getting appropriate workplace accommodations if you don't disclose that you have a long-term condition, then it's very unlikely you're going to be able to request accommodations. And so people found themselves in this bind where their need for workplace accommodation competed with their fear of discrimination, and they didn't know which one to pay attention to. And what people talked about was having knowledge about their rights, and their adjustment options were helpful, where they, which gave them a little bit more confidence to disclose. But again, this relates back to IFS principles around personalised support, the employment specialists building relationships with employers. So it's, again, more of a networking approach, and that's part of the mix. And there's some interesting articles that have been kind of written on this idea of disclosure itself, because disclosure kind of, it has the implication that you're disclosing something negative. Whereas, there's a bit of discussion around, well, actually, why don't we talk about, for example, managing personal information as a term used by one of the authors on that. We all manage personal information. We all choose what to share and not to share. Instead of talking about disclosure, can we talk about what we share and what we don't share and why? So the second to last point was around contending with the rights and fear of discrimination in a new workplace. So this is once people had work, but they were trying to maintain it in the first part of employment. So it was quite common for people with long-term conditions to tolerate anxiety about a commute, discrimination or poor working conditions even, in order to maintain the employment where they felt they had limited opportunities. And the contrast to that was where employers were really supportive, people felt really empowered and loyal. So I guess there's a question here around, are people with long-term conditions tolerating poorer work conditions or higher anxiety because of this fear of not having very many opportunities? So this relates to the IPS principles of employment specialists spending a lot of time in the workplace with employers, and also to educate and to create opportunities. So you're creating, hopefully, the environment where employers are supportive. But also, I think it highlights a possible gap, which is, if somebody is working with a vocational, in vocational rehab or with an employment specialist, how are those people who are experiencing poor conditions in their current job supported and empowered? And again, we had those conversations. That was something that the stakeholder reference groups were quite interested to explore, because they thought it was something that wasn't coming up a lot in their experience. So the last point, and maybe the most important one in my mind, is that experiences were instrumental in influencing beliefs and attitudes. And this went across all the different types of participants. So we were talking about employers, but also people who are living with long-term conditions in their family and whānau, their communities. So people had concerns, employers tended to have concerns about risk, which negatively influenced hiring decisions if they held those concerns. But then they had this other thing where the support services were seen as a safety net. So where the support services were available, kind of mitigated that risk. For some employers, I think. Employers tended to be more open to hiring people with a long-term condition if they had either personal or professional prior experiences of a long-term condition. So where they knew a little bit more about what this meant and how it could work, they were more open to hiring people. Again, that probably speaks well to the sort of to education being important and to experiences being important. Employers were motivated to create opportunities where they are motivated to create opportunities, they can be helped along by support services. People found that employers again found that there were unexpected positive results sometimes from more diverse hiring policies. So, they were challenged to think about different ways of doing things or different ways of allocating work, for example, that worked for them. They had positive experiences of work for people. So this is for people with long-term conditions, and where they had positive experiences of work, that increased their confidence for future work. So it kind of made it seem possible. And that was true of families as well. And so all of the above can be either negatively or positively influenced by things like funding models and organisational policies. So, for example, there was a lot of discussion from the North American studies where they had changed from a kind of low caseload approach to a quantity of placements approach in the way that services were funded. And what tended to happen is that there were more people, in the latter, there were more people falling through the cracks because people tended to, the services tended to do what they were paid for and focus on getting people into placements. And then, of course, they were looking for placements that were easy to place people in and also people that were easy to place. And so there were, there wasn't really, there was much less of a focus on the quality of the match between the job and the person. And so people who had more negative experiences and therefore were less willing to work. And similarly, I would say for employers, where employers have negative experiences, then they're probably less likely to hire people in the future. So I guess there are, from that, I picked out a few key challenges which are highlighted from that qualitative review. One being that the effects of the socio-cultural norms and biases are pretty significant. So, like, for example, disclosure being a double-edged sword and people feeling the need to prove their worth with having strategies for coping with work that sometimes actually compromise other parts of their life. And then the other is that the structures are a major influence on success. And that's that thing of, service providers are often stretched. They do what they're paid to do, and they are paid to do, and sometimes those can have unintended consequences. I'm not going to go into detail about the questions and challenges that this raises because I realise that I'm pretty well over time at the moment. But I do want to briefly mention that we found very, very little which focused on Indigenous peoples in that part of our review. And our Māori stakeholder reference group actually raised a significant issue about the way that we're conceptualising work. So we're talking a lot about paid work, and when we talk about paid work, we talk a lot about employment. But actually, the discussion in this group raised the fact that actually what we're really interested in, if we pare it right back, is that people can live. And so, are we actually, we're talking about what helps people to live. Are we actually thinking, well, what's a safe, legal livelihood? And so maybe livelihood is something we need to be thinking more about beyond just paid work. And there is some research around Indigenous livelihood that we did find that you can read a little bit more about if you access that summary of findings. And we're going to write a little bit more about in some future publications as well. And the other thing that they raised is that, because the tested intervention, namely individual placement and support, has been developed in a very westernised concept. Actually, we need to be thinking a lot about what Māori-led approaches would be to address economic and health inequities. So I think a couple of key opportunities identified just to end. Visibility, I think it was pretty clear from this review that visibility affects acceptability. So how obvious it is that people are living with long-term conditions and are coping and succeeding in paid work. Employers who had good experiences were more interested to offer positions, and people and families with good experiences were confident that it could work. And then, if we're thinking about a principle-based approach, if that's, what's showing to be successful, then we need to think about what that is for us in our context. So there are impressive results coming through from this IPS approach. We can see that the principles clearly mapped onto the qualitative research. But, how do we think about that? How do we think about transferability into other settings and other populations? And also, we need to be thinking about what an Indigenous-led, perhaps principle-based approach might look like. So, not too badly over time.
Thank you, Jo. That's really fabulous. And rather than spend ages on discussion, what I do want to, we've got Claire with us, who has who's one of the students, I think perhaps doing 706 maybe.
Yes.
Yep. And so I do just want to check whether Claire's got any questions she'd love to ask you while you're here in person. Because Rob and Rochelle and I are all really familiar with the Padlet discussion page that goes alongside these presentations, and we can bung up any questions that are there and make sure you get them and pursue the discussion that way. But I do just want to check, Claire, have you, while you've got Jo here in person and all to yourself, is there anything you'd like to ask her?
No, I think that was it's makes you think about things. It was very good, Jo, just despite distractions and things. So well done.
It's COVID.
I know. No, that was awesome. It is something to make. I just do BOC. That's all I do. So it's nice to see the other side of the need for return to work, and it's not just BOC, and there's a lot more, you know, the mental health side, and people that have been out of work for so long. So I'm just so used to, oh, you've got 6 weeks to get this person back to work and work with that. So that was really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
Good. Jo, thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure your son will be delighted to have your undivided attention now for a little while. And so thank you so much for making this work within a very difficult set of circumstances. We are very grateful. Yeah,
thanks, Jo.
So, and all the best for your well-being in Alert Level 3.
Thank you. Rob, you would like to say something, I think.
Just two things. The first thing is just to say that Helen Lockett's coming to talk to us in a couple of weeks' time about IPS specifically. So this is an excellent lead into that. The other thing I was going to ask was, it was just perfect. The other thing I was going to ask was, would it be preferable for you, given all the disruptions you've had, that rather than stream this talk, that we stream the talk that's on the Work Counts site?
No, I think this one was more tailored to this particular audience, so I'd actually prefer to stream this one.
Yeah, great.
I dare say that we could edit this and edit out all the clunky bits at the beginning when we were talking about all sorts of stuff.
Go on a difficult job.
It's lovely to see you, Jo.
Yeah.
Bye.
Ka kite.